Hey everyone, welcome. Today, we are jumping right into Unit 8 of AP World History, the Cold War and Decolonization. We're going to break down one of the most game-changing periods in all of modern history to get you absolutely prepped for that AP exam.
All right, so first things first, let's talk about the exam, because that's why we're here, right? Unit 8 is going to be about 8 to 10% of your total score. Now, that might not sound like a ton, but trust me, the concepts packed in here are absolutely critical for making sense of the world we live in today. At its heart, this entire unit is really built around two massive stories that are happening at the exact same time. On one side, you've got this brand new global showdown between two superpowers. And on the other, the old system of global empires that had been around for centuries is just falling apart. And the key thing to remember is that these two stories are constantly tangled up with each other.
So, to keep things super clear, we're just going to follow the official AP unit structure. We'll start right after World War II and take it all the way to the end of the Cold War. Okay, let's dive right in. So World War II just completely wrecks the old European powers like Britain and France. I mean, they are economically exhausted, their militaries are drained, and this creates a gigantic power vacuum on the world stage.
And who steps into that vacuum? Well, you've got two new heavyweights, the United States and the Soviet Union. The US mainland was completely untouched by the fighting, its factories were booming, and it pumped money into rebuilding Europe with the Marshall Plan. The Soviets, yeah, they were devastated, but they had this immense state-controlled industrial power and tons of resources. And then there's the tech. The US drops the atomic bomb, showing off this terrifying new power. But it doesn't take long for the Soviets to get their own, and just like that, the arms race is on.
So this new power setup doesn't stay neutral for long. It quickly hardens into a global ideological fight. This creates what historians call a bipolar world. Basically, the planet gets split into two opposing teams, each led by one of the superpowers. And this slide, wow, it just lays out the core conflict perfectly. It's like you've got two completely different operating systems for how a country should run. You've got the US model, democratic capitalism, all about free markets and individual rights. And then you have the Soviet model, authoritarian communism, where the state controls everything and the group comes before the individual. But here's the kicker. Both of them were absolutely convinced that their way was the only right way for the rest of the world. Now, because a direct war between these two nuclear powers would be, the end of the world, they had to find another way to fight. And they did, through something called proxy wars. They would pour money, weapons, and training into opposite sides of smaller regional conflicts, basically turning other countries into their battlegrounds. The consequences for those nations were, as you can imagine, devastating. And this timeline really drives home how the Cold War's violence was basically outsourced all over the planet. You see it in the brutal fighting in Korea, the long drawn-out war in Vietnam, the civil war in Angola after it got independence, and even in Central America with the Contra War in Nicaragua. The superpower rivalry was fueling fires on nearly every continent. But hanging over this entire period was the constant, terrifying threat of nuclear war. This led to a pretty insane doctrine called mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. The whole idea created this balance of terror. Basically, nobody would be crazy enough to launch their nukes because they knew the other side would launch theirs right back, and then everybody would be wiped out. This scary logic was put to the ultimate test in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest the world has ever come to full-blown nuclear Armageddon. Okay, so let's track how this whole ideological battle spread. Communism didn't just stay in the Soviet Union. No way. It went global. And as it spread, it changed and adapted to local situations, often with wildly different results. The biggest country where communism took root was, of course, China. After a long and bloody civil war, Mao Zedong's Communist Party took over. Now, his brand of communism was a bit different, focused more on peasants. But his attempt to rapidly industrialize the countryside, a policy called the Great Leap Forward, was an absolute catastrophe. It led to one of the deadliest famines in all of human history. So remember that second big story? At the exact same time the Cold War is raging, the old European colonial empires are crumbling. This collapse unleashes this huge wave of decolonization, and dozens of new independent countries pop up all over Asia and Africa. And it's super important to know that independence didn't happen the same way everywhere. You kind of had two main paths. Some countries, like India and Ghana, were able to negotiate their independence. This usually happened when the European power was already weak, and there weren't many European settlers living there. But for others, it was a brutal, violent fight. an armed struggle. This was common in places like Algeria, where a big European settler population refused to give up control. But getting free, that was just the first hurdle. These brand new countries faced so many challenges. Political instability was everywhere. Just look at Angola's civil war. But maybe the worst thing they inherited were the completely random borders drawn by the colonial powers, borders that paid zero attention to who actually lived there. The violent partition of India is probably the most tragic example of this, creating conflicts that are still going on today.
So, in an era with all this change, it's no surprise that you also see powerful movements rising up to challenge the old ways of doing things, not just fighting colonial powers, but also taking on oppressive governments and social systems right at home. And people resisted in all sorts of ways. You have the incredible moral power of nonviolent civil disobedience, a strategy perfected by Gandhi and later used by Martin Luther King Jr. You also see people who tried nonviolence, but then shifted to armed struggle when it didn't work, like Nelson Mandela did against apartheid in South Africa. And tragically, this period also saw unbelievable violence used by states and by terrorist groups to either keep or take power.
All right, so after decades of tension that shaped the entire globe, the Cold War came to an end. And what's crazy is just how fast it all happened in the late 1980s.
It wasn't just one thing that brought it down. It was really a perfect storm of factors. The Soviet economy was a mess, it just couldn't compete. The US, under President Reagan, started spending a ton on the military, which forced the Soviets into an arms race they simply couldn't afford. They got bogged down in a disastrous war in Afghanistan, their version of Vietnam, and then finally, a new leader came along who actually admitted the system was broken.
That leader was Mikhail Gorbachev, and he brought in two huge reforms. The first was perestroika, or restructuring, which was supposed to fix the economy. The second was glasnost, or openness, which allowed people to criticize the government. Now, his goal was to save the Soviet Union, but what he actually did was open the floodgates. He accidentally unleashed forces that ripped the whole system apart. The second Gorbachev signaled that he wasn't going to use the Soviet army to keep the communist governments of Eastern Europe in power. The whole thing just unraveled with unbelievable speed. 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself, it's gone. It officially dissolved. The Cold War was over.
Okay, so for the exam, this is the kind of big picture causation you need to have locked in. Think of it like a chain reaction. First, World War II shatters the old world order. That weakness in Europe creates the perfect opening for both the Cold War and decolonization to kick off. Then, that Cold War rivalry directly shapes all these new countries. And finally, all these pressures, both inside and outside the Soviet Union, build up until the whole thing just collapses. See how it all connects?
So let's wrap this all up. What are the biggest takeaways from Unit 8? 1. The Cold War was an ideological fight that played out globally through proxy wars. 2. At the same time, empires fell and new nations were born, facing huge problems. 3. And this is key, these two stories were completely intertwined. And 4. The Cold War finally ended because the Soviet system just couldn't sustain itself anymore. If you remember those 4 points, you're in great shape.
And that brings us to one last thing to think about. When you look at the world today, which legacy of this crazy era do you think is causing the most problems? Is it the nuclear weapons still floating around, the messy borders that were drawn decades ago, or the lingering ideological conflicts? It's a tough question, and it really shows you that understanding this period is absolutely essential to understanding our own time.